Bona tarda i benvinguts a un nou webinar de claustre obert a la recerca educativa, a l'entorn i a la mirada internacional, un cicle de la Direcció General d'Innovació, Recerca i Cultura Digital del Departament d'Educació. En aquesta ocasió, i també en el webinar del proper dijous dia 10, l'organització s'ha realitzat conjuntament amb el Consolat General dels Estats Units d'Amèrica a Barcelona, a qui agraïm l'entesa, i també amb la col·laboració de l'Steam Conference Barcelona, que aquest any va tenir lloc ara fa unes setmanes de forma virtual. El webinar d'avui es titula Tools for Tinkering, eines pel tinkering, i comptem amb la presència de Ryan Jenkins, qui compartirà la seva experiència en aquest camp amb nosaltres. El Ryan és educador i cofundador de Wonderful Idea Co., un innovador estudi creatiu situat al nord de Califòrnia que treballa en l'àmbit de l'STEAM des de la perspectiva del moviment maker i de la metodologia tinkering. El Ryan forma educadors per proveir-los de recursos i idees per poder integrar la metodologia maker i el tinkering a l'aula, amb l'objectiu d'experimentar amb la creació i la manipulació de materials. En Ryan ha treballat en moltes escoles i també a diferents institucions com l'Exploratorium de Los Angeles, el MIT, la Lego Foundation i també les escoles de Reggio Emilia. Ell mateix també exposa les seves creacions de tinkering fetes amb varietat de materials, llum i moviment. El Ryan primer ens farà una presentació d'uns 15-20 minuts per endinsar-nos en el món del tinkering. Ho farà en anglès, després li farem unes preguntes per aprofundir en aspectes pedagògics i finalment tenim un torn d'obert de preguntes al xat. Així doncs, sense més preàmbuls, Ryan, welcome. We are glad to have you here and we are happy that you share your experience with us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us for this evening discussion. I'm really excited to share about tinkering, which is a way to approach learning about STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, maths, and other subjects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience, how I got started with tinkering, talk about some of the qualities of a tinkering project or environment, and then we'll share some practical ideas about how schools can get started with tinkering in your own classrooms or institutions. Before I talk about myself, I just wanted to mention this word tinkering. It's a bit of a strange word. It's in English, it actually comes from the sound of someone who would fix pots and pans on the street. So just the tink, tink, tink of the hammer on the bottom of a pan was the idea of figuring things out, repairing objects, just using your experience and what you have around you. Myself and other colleagues have adapted the word tinkering to mean an open-ended approach to education that really values the learner's own ideas as the way through the process. This is based on a constructivist style of education and a constructionist style of education, where thinking with your hands is a really great way to learn about new ideas. I just wanted to share a couple minutes about myself and how I got started with tinkering. About 15 years ago, I started working at a museum in San Francisco, California called the Exploratorium. This is a huge science center that is focused on not only science, but also art and human perception. And there are hundreds of exhibits to explore motion, light and shadow, sound, optical illusions. You name it, there is a small demonstration that you can manipulate and experiment with. I worked with a group that started out as something called the Pi Project. And this was some initials that stood for playful inventions and explorations. So when I think about tinkering, this idea of playful invention and exploration is really built into the definition of the word. After doing workshops with teachers and pop-up events in the museum, we started to develop a permanent place on the museum floor where kids and adults could work with their hands and engage with real tools and materials. I love this picture because this was when we were in the process of building our studio. We had contractors building the walls and the storage units behind the space. And right next door, we had kids and parents tinkering and making and constructing themselves tracks for marbles to roll down. These experiments led to space in the new version of the Exploratorium called the Tinkering Studio. And in this environment, there were stations for people to explore how objects float on columns of air, connecting motors, lights, and batteries with wires to discover the basics of electricity, or using recycled materials, hobby motors, and AA batteries to create unique art-making devices. We did many experiments like creating a vending machine full of kits so you can find the hard-to-get tinkering parts, creating events for adults to engage with tinkering activities like sewing with conductive thread, or inviting many artists from around the world to share their process and allow us to get inspired by the way that they work. About 3 years ago, myself and a colleague, Nicole Cottret, started a studio called Wonderful Idea Co. to continue these experiments with art, science, and technology and try them out in many different places, in a park, at an art museum, in schools or in libraries, and see how many different ways we can experiment with tinkering activities, environments, and facilitation styles. We've done residencies at museums and schools, all kinds of educational institutions. This was one we did in Taiwan in last December, where we built a computational Rube Goldberg machine. We've found that all over the world, people are fascinated with this process of playing with materials, working with their hands, and collaborating with each other. A couple other workshops that we've had the chance to do are working with a group of facilitators in Saudi Arabia who then led a summer program for 100 male and female high school students to engage with some of these ideas. Also on the top corner, you can see about 1 year ago, I was in the northwest corner of India doing a workshop with Tibetan Buddhist monks and investigating the connections between science, literacy, and traditional Buddhist ways of understanding the world. Lately, we've also been experimenting with the intersection between the physical and the digital world. So taking our tinkering investigations and seeing what happens when we combine programming with microcontrollers, LEDs, and motors, and doing that alongside working with power tools or building giant cardboard creations. Over the past months, we've also been, like I'm sure many of you have, taking our experiments online and trying to figure out what it's like tinkering virtually and remote with both children and adults. So Now that you know a little bit about how I've got started tinkering, I wanted to spend a few more minutes thinking about what are the qualities that make a tinkering experience something that's worth having in an educational setting. So the first off, I like to share this slide to talk about the difference between making and tinkering. For us, making activity might look something like what's on the left side of the screen, where people are putting together pieces of a kit. This is a really cool art robot, and you follow the instructions, you put together the parts, and at the end, everyone has the same drawing machine. So there's probably some things you can learn from that sort of making or assembly. But for us, it's a little more interesting to design activities that look more like what's on the right, which is also an art machine activity. But for this, it involves a wide range of materials, many different examples, and neither the participants nor the facilitators know what's going to happen in these activities. The next video I want to share is about combining art, science, and technology. So I think it's just about 15 seconds. So this was an experiment that we did earlier this year when we still could travel in Kuwait, where we were designing art making machines that used a microbit or a microcontroller that you could program to move in different ways. I think when we mention this idea of art, science, and technology, we want to create activities where it's hard to tell where the differences are and where the lines are between is this an art activity or is this a science activity. We think this is important because there might be many different ways that students or learners jump into the activities. They might be more interested in art, but through this project, they get a chance to experiment with engineering or programming or science, and it might work the other way around. So besides the topics, it's also important to think about the content, the process, and the emotions of the learning experience. So I wanted just to share a short video from one of our teacher workshops about a toy dissection activity.
All a new vocabulary. So we're talking about capacitors, resistors, DC motors, transistors, the gears, and describing the movement and trying to see how everything. I never thought all this was in this little toy. It was for me, it was very inspiring.
So I love this video because in about 15 seconds, this teacher mentions all three of these ideas, that she's experimenting with new electronic components, transistors, resistors, capacitors, learning some terms and vocabulary. She's also learning a process of writing down or drawing what she did and what she made. And finally, she talks about the emotion of the experience and how maybe she thought of these subjects as something that was dry or uninteresting before, but in this different way of learning about electronics, it becomes emotional or inspiring. So the next part of tinkering that I'd like to focus on is the idea of using everyday materials in new ways. So here's a quick video from another teacher workshop.
Oh, that's neat.
This is when everyone, with a lunch rush hour, when everyone starts ordering fries. So for this workshop, we reconceptualized the idea of the chairs in the classroom. So the first thing we did was we stood up, we took our chairs, we put them on the table, and we started building these marble mazes and contraptions. I think this quality of using common materials in unusual ways is so important for developing skills for students to think about the world as something that is changeable and remixable, something that they can not just take the accepted knowledge, but they can use what's around them and create new things and new ideas out of them. And finally, the last important quality of a tinkering experience, it allows you to build something bigger than yourself. We always look for connections in tinkering activities and ways of collaborating with those around us. So this is a giant chain reaction machine that was built by about 40 educators at a museum conference. And each one of the little tables is an interesting exploration of materials and ideas, but altogether it becomes something where you can learn from each other, get inspired by other people's work, and connect to a bigger world of art, science, engineering, or technology. So now that I've discussed a bit about the qualities of the tinkering environments and activities, I wanted to share some common strategies and best practices that I've seen schools use to integrate tinkering into their programs. And so the first and maybe the most important way that schools can support tinkering is by creating time for teachers to be the learners and to try the activities for themselves. This is so important to give teachers and educators the chance to put themselves in the shoes of the learners, and notice when there are moments of excitement, when things get frustrating, to notice when they want help from a facilitator and when they'd rather be left alone to focus and concentrate on their projects. We think that schools and teachers can use these experiences to reflect on what this tinkering approach to STEAM learning looks like, and then make a plan for the next steps, both in a practical sense, but also in a philosophical sense, to think with each other about what sort of learning experiences you'd like to provide to the students. The next one is to strive to include tinkering across many different activities. We were thinking today about tinkering as an approach to STEAM learning, but actually there are connections to many other subjects, and we see that people learn better when they are engaged in meaningful hands-on projects, and that could relate to language arts, history, poetry, gardening, programming, technology. We think that tinkering can be integrated into the school day across a wide variety of subjects and can start to break down the borders between these subjects. So on the left side, you can see a blackout poetry experiment where then teachers were creating a moving sculpture to represent their poem. Or the one on the right where we were designing sensors and light up sculptures to be a part of the school garden project. The next best practice that we've seen in terms of how schools can embrace a tinkering mindset is by shaking things up and changing things around when it comes to classroom settings, age groups, content, and other traditional structures. This doesn't mean you have to blow up everything, all the structures in your school, but we wonder, and we've seen schools that make time in the day where students aren't separated by age or grade, but are separated by interest and by shared projects. It's amazing to see in these settings how older kids can become mentors to the younger students, and how engaged and interested the younger students can be when an older peer is the one who's showing them something that they're authentically excited about. It also might be interesting for your school to experiment with changing the environment. So maybe there's some time where students aren't sitting in desks in rows, but they have the freedom to move around a space, grab tools and materials as needed, and work with each other in the way that makes the most sense, even if it's on the floor on a giant piece of white butcher paper. We've also seen that schools can't make meaningful change in a bubble. They have to connect to other people in the community. So they're connecting to local artists and community organizations like libraries, maker spaces, museums, and after-school clubs. One of the favorite ways that I've seen a school do this is one that we've been partnering with in Oakland called Lodestar Charter School. And instead of a science fair or a competition, they've created a maker fair or a Tinker Fest in their auditorium, where students can share in-progress prototypes and also connect to outside makers and artists who are working with similar ideas and materials. And finally, it's important to recognize in a school context that tinkering isn't the only way to learn, and it's not necessarily the best way to learn everything. So for us, the most effective schools are the ones that combine a tinkering approach with other ways of teaching and learning. So there might be time where a teacher is instructing the class on a certain part of the project. There might be time where there's a guided inquiry where everyone is working on the same problem. But we feel like those types of teaching and learning are enhanced when there's also time for students to be in charge of their own learning, not only problem solving, but also problem posing. So I think that for us, this process of developing a tinkering mindset in a school system takes time. It can be a project that lasts over many years, and it's something that you can start making small changes to adapt to this style of teaching and learning. So finally, I wanted to just spend a few minutes mentioning the way that we've been changing a tinkering approach and see other schools and educational partners changing an approach to meet our current moment of online learning or hybrid learning during the pandemic. I think that tinkering is actually really well suited to this moment. Tinkering is a style of learning that values flexibility and problem solving and experimentation, which is something that we've all had to do as we've been moving our programs online. So some of the things that have been important for us to think about. The first one is around the materials that you use for these activities. So many schools are doing different approaches, either inviting students and parents to collect all the materials, common elements around their house. There are many tinkering activities that you can do with things that almost everyone has at home, like toilet paper tubes, cardboard boxes, food packaging. So teachers and educators are designing activities that fit with those materials. We've also seen schools provide a complete tinkering set to their students. So have a moment where these kits can be mailed to students, or parents can drive by and pick up some special parts or elements that the students need to work on the activities. For us, we've been using actually kind of a hybrid approach where we've been encouraging students to collect a lot of the materials that they have already around their house. And then we're just sending some small crucial materials, kind of like the vending machine in the previous slide, just a small motor or a microcontroller or a special kind of wire, something that they can use as their projects. We also think that it's really important with the materials that the students take some ownership and they can start developing a tinkering space or materials storage bins for their house, so they have all the parts and tools to continue working on these activities. We also find that these online tinkering activities work best when you allow for students to engage differently in the process. So having some opportunities for the group to meet together and start working on some shared activities, but also have moments for students to share projects online or have some more informal drop-in hours where they can ask questions to a facilitator or to each other. One of the joys of tinkering online is the fact that that we're not as constrained by the times that we might be in a school or a museum setting. So we found that there's been plenty of moments where we end the activity for the day, but we tell the participants, the students, that they can keep working on the activity for as long as they want, because they have the materials and tools at home to continue experimenting with the projects. And it's been really, I think, more of a chance for the learners, the students, to take ownership over their process, where they can decide and get interested in spending more time on their projects. And finally, we've been inspired by the ways that some schools and educators have connected with a global community of makers and tinkerers as part of their online programs. So this could take the shape of inviting in artists, either local artists or people from the other side of the world, to share about their projects or process, or give a virtual tour of their space. We've also been looking at ways where learners can share their projects with each other in a classroom setting. We've been using Padlet as a message board. There are many other versions of this. But also there are plenty of platforms where students can share with a larger group of students. We recommend Scratch for a programming language is a great model where students can share their projects with others, make comments, ask questions, remix each other's projects, and get inspired to try new things. So in this way, even as we're online, maybe tinkering can be a way where we open up a window to a larger community and a larger world. So I think with that, we'll see if there are any questions from the group about tinkering in schools or online tinkering projects.
Thank you very much, Ryan. What you have said and all the examples you have given are really helpful for us. And I want to ask you several questions to make clearer some aspects that may be useful for teachers. So in the presentation, it seems like tinkering activities are really fun and engaging, but teachers sometimes think is really learning happening when students are tinkering, and how we see the evidence of learning happening in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Great. Perfect. Glad you asked. So I think for this, the first step is identifying with a group of colleagues what learning looks like to you. For us at the Exploratorium, we identified some qualities that were important to us, thinking about collaboration, development of understanding or learning how to learn, students taking initiative and deciding to do the next step in their project without being told by a teacher or facilitator what to do. So those are, for examples of some of the things that we recognized as what learning might look like in a tinkering activity. And then I think the activity are the photos that I showed because they're very engaging and interesting to see. But actually, that's just the first half of the tinkering experience. We think that after doing the hands-on part of the tinkering, it's also just as important that there's time for reflection and discussion and time for the participants or the students to reflect on what they were learning and what they were doing in the activities. So we've been inspired by a group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education called Project Zero that's created thinking routines that can help organize some of these reflective discussions where students can share what they learned from the activities. We've also seen many schools have a portfolio system of evaluation. So instead of a test at the end of the semester, the whole time the students are collecting the projects that they were working on, writing about the things that worked and the things that didn't, keeping track of the ideas they had for later, creating a document of their process that can be at least one way that we can evaluate what the students learned in these activities.
Okay. What do you think in primary and secondary schools, what is the best way to integrate tinkering into classroom environments and activities? Are there models that have worked especially well?
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit before the session. I think that tinkering looks different in all different settings, whether it's a primary school or a secondary school. And really, it depends on the group and what makes the most sense. So, we've seen schools where the energy is put into a central tinkering studio or makerspace with tools and materials where all the classes can go in and try out the activities. And that can be a really nice model because it creates a place where students and teachers know that this is a different sort of environment where you're engaging with ideas in a more learner-driven way. Other schools we've seen have tinkering integrated into all their subjects. So every teacher, whether they're doing art or history or English, they're able to, or they're encouraged to build in tinkering experiences as part of the lessons. So, they might have some time where they're, like I said, doing a guided exploration or talking about a specific subject. And inside of the lesson, there also might be time for the students to tinker and build and construct. So I think I think for that, I feel like it should be something that is valued in kindergartens, in secondary schools, in universities and primary schools. I think all over, having the chance to have a knowledge that is not just in your head, but is also embodied in your hands is a really important practice and quality to emphasize.
And you have seen a lot of schools, and Are there things that schools often overlook when setting up spaces or time for tinkering? And which elements are necessary to have in place before getting started, and which elements can be developed over time?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've noticed in a lot of schools is underestimating the space and time that it takes to do tinkering activities. So I think it's really important as your school is developing this tinkering approach that you make sure you um, create space for both the tools and the materials and the projects that are created. We did cabinets of curiosities where we could show the projects that the students are working on, but definitely thinking about ways to create enough room for all the materials for tinkering is really important. And also, like I mentioned, just making sure to have time where teachers can play with the materials, plan and prep the ideas, have some moments to get started doing these projects. And then I think, like I mentioned, it's really important to start small. I think one common misconception is that you need to buy a lot of new tools and technology before you start tinkering. And I actually think it works best the other way around. Start to do some projects with the materials you already have. They could be recycled materials that are donated. Maybe there's, I don't know, a giant box of Legos somewhere in your school, but start to do some open-ended experiments with those materials that are around, and see what kind of learning it develops. And then from there, you can decide if your school really needs a 3D printer or 50 Arduinos. Maybe you do because there are exciting projects that you've identified in the course of your explorations. But I think having some initial experiences first are really important before you buy all of the equipment you need for a tinkering studio or space.
Okay, I have a last question. We know that tinkering is an open activity. You don't know exactly what is going to happen in the classroom. Let's talk a bit about the role of the educator in this situation.
Yeah.
And how do you go about facilitating moments of frustration and failure on the parts of the students? Or what do you do as an educator if learner wants to make something there you don't know the next step or the answer to the question?
Yeah, great. So I think it's really important. I mean, there's a few elements of that question. I think first, it's really important for the facilitator or the teacher to model saying, I don't know the answer to this. Let's figure it out. And just by not thinking you need to be the expert and know everything in ahead of time, but actually what your role is as the educator is modeling, looking up ideas, playing with materials, troubleshooting the parts, asking others for help. These are all strategies that happen when something doesn't go according to plan, that facilitators or teachers can be instrumental in modeling and showing for the students. I also think it's really important. One of the things I always take away from Mike Petrich, who is one of the directors of the Tinkering Studio, one of my mentors, always was mentioning the importance of facilitating bad ideas. So sometimes a student or a learner might want to do something, and as an educator, you think, oh no, there's no way that could ever work. I can't believe that this student will create a launcher to, fling this 30 feet away. But instead of saying that, just starting to ask some questions, allowing the student to identify what they're doing, you'll be surprised at how many times you didn't think something was possible, and the students will come up with a solution that really works. And just being open to that is a really important step as a facilitator. And then I think the last thing to keep in mind, if it's possible to have a second colleague or teacher with you in the space as an observer, and then switching that role, it's really hard to facilitate a tinkering activity and also reflect on what happened in the moment. So we like to either have someone live, just as an observer role, that they could write down notes and you could talk about the facilitation strategies, or you might just take a lot of videos or photos of the process, and then as a group, you know, we used to do something where almost we would pause the frame and try to imagine, what is the learner thinking in this moment? What is the facilitator thinking in this moment? What are all the different ways that the teacher might engage, from asking a question to giving a hint to just passing material? And through those conversations, you can start to develop a facilitation strategy that can meet even those challenging moments.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Let's move to the chat to
Great.
attend more questions. Chris Cooley asked, what are some ways of documenting students' progress? And also Ana Perez asked about assessment in open-ended activities. You have talked a bit about portfolio. What do you think about documenting the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think those questions go hand in hand, and I think that it's great if we can create moments where students can document their own process, and they can take the role of the documentarian. Some things we've tried is creating a photo booth or a photo station in the class where learners can take their projects. One of my favorite examples of this was developed by a colleague named Tiffany Sang, and she did a build in progress turntable that captured not just the finished product, but also all the steps across the way and the things that didn't work according to plan. I think developing some sort of a vocabulary or a way of celebrating those moments, not as like celebrating failure, that's the goal, but to say, we, as a way of working through the activity, it's important to keep track of the challenges that came up, the things that didn't work, and those are all parts of the process that will help us understand how to make things better or change it the next time. And then, lately we've been doing a lot of documentation on sharing online on our remote workshops. We've been using Padlet because it's a kind of open website where you can post videos, photos, or even do text. And actually, that's been a great way in some of our summer camps or courses where there's a reason to document, because then others are either commenting or liking or asking questions about your posts. And in terms of assessment, I think it goes hand in hand. I think with these activities, I think it's really important to make room for qualitative assessment. So not just focusing on the scores or on the numbers, but really thinking about the ways that the students can document their work, that they can talk about the work. Doing presentations and talks can be something that is a way for them to assess their learning. I've seen schools do peer assessments where students are talking about and evaluating each other's work. And I think, I'm also inspired by the Reggio Emilia style of documentation that, of course, is really well developed for preschoolers, where they're creating books and documents about the learning process. I'd love to see some of those techniques be applied to primary school or secondary school courses or classrooms.
Thank you, Ryan. We have another question. ML Forjan is asking about the timetable and the frequency. Once a week is what you do at Genius Hour. We don't have these kind of things here in Catalonia. Yeah. Genius Hour.
So I do think it's important. Just in terms of that term, I do think it's important that tinkering isn't seen as the special thing that you can only do if you are really good at the subject or really interested or really passionate about it. I think tinkering should be the activity that is actually for the students who aren't so good at school or aren't as engaged with the process. I think those are the students that might benefit the most from having some open-ended time for tinkering. So I think, I love doing tinkering as part of an educational practice, so I say as much as possible. But I think no matter how you integrate it into your classroom, I don't think tinkering should be the treat or I forget who said, but a colleague was mentioning like chocolate poured over broccoli, and I always think about that. I don't think tinkering should be the chocolate poured over the nutritious learning activity to make it more exciting. But I think we should work to identify the real learning that happens through tinkering and how that can be an authentic part of the learning experience.
Okay, thank you. We don't have any more questions. Chris Coley say thank you, a lot of ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Okay, I have one last question for Perfect. You. Do you think that tinkering can help to shorten this break, this traditional break we have between science and humanities or arts in the schools? I mean.
Yeah, I think it can do that in school, and it can do it in life. I think that it's kind of an artificial divide between art and science that is in the educational system. I think that a lot of times the way that an artist and a scientist go about understanding the world is really similar. Art and science are both a process of making observations, asking questions, trying experiments, and sharing those ideas with other people. I also think tinkering can give people the chance to experiment with being an artist or a scientist. I think it's really important that we don't think of an artist as a scientist as a specific person. You're an artist, so you do art, or you're a scientist, so you do science. I think we should encourage everyone as a way of understanding the world and as a way of understanding themselves to explore through making art or through doing experiments.
So thank you very much, Ryan. It has been a pleasure to listen to you. And we hope next time we have the opportunity to meet you in person in Barcelona.
Great. And I put my email and social media, Twitter account on the slide. I'd love it if people got in touch. I'd be really curious to know more about how people are working with tinkering in the schools in Catalonia and Barcelona and around.
Ok, thank you. Moltes gràcies als que heu seguit de la intervenció en directe i podeu recuperar el webinar i també informació complementària al web del Claustre Obert. Moltes gràcies. Bona tarda.